I'm David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee and the Tennessean. We thank our viewing audience. You're watching a live interview with Mr. Bill Lee, businessman and candidate for governor, the Republican nominee. Here we have in the room our editor and VP, Michael Anastasi. We have Jack McElroy, who is the executive editor of the News Sentinel in Knoxville, and Alex Hubbard, columnist for the Tennessean. We want to thank Mr. Lee very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we wanted to ask you at first, tell us who you are, what you stand for, and maybe what misconceptions, if any, there might be of you.
I am a seventh generation Tennessean, so my family came here in 1796 and has been here ever since. I grew up in Williamson County in on a cattle farm that I still live on today with my wife and my family. Multiple family members were third generation. I'm a third generation cattle farmer. My family's been involved in the ag business for multiple generations, and also run a company called Lee Company here locally. We are primarily a construction service company, heating and air conditioning, plumbing, and electrical business. We employ about 1,200 folks, mostly skilled tradespeople. And so that's my business background. I am currently married. Actually had a tragedy in my life years ago, lost my first wife. And I oftentimes say God used that tragic experience to really change my perspective and actually caused me to become very engaged in nonprofit work that ultimately led to this decision to serve. My belief that the highest call for my life is to serve, and that came in part out of tragedy in my life. But I'm married. I have 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and still live on the farm where I grew up.
Okay. So could you talk specifically about how your experiences as a businessman will make you effective as a leader in crisis and success in the state?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you know, the governor is the head of the executive branch of government, and so I think that being an executive leader is really an important qualification for pursuing this particular office of governor. And as a leader of a corporation, our company has about $250 million annual budget. I think one of the most important things a governor does is establish and set and help to determine what the state's budget's going to be and how it is that we're going to manage that budget. So I think managing a budget, and particularly through crisis, you know, I referenced a tragedy in my life, and there are actually multiple things around that season of life that were difficult. One of them was I left my business for a couple years, for the most part, to take care of my kids when I lost my first wife. And when I came back, our company was in deep trouble. Without going into all the details of that, we were just in deep trouble. And we had to make very difficult decisions around cutting a budget and closing offices and in order to save that company. And that's the type of experience that certainly shaped who I am as a business person, how I approach difficult challenges, how I approach managing a budget in difficult times, because certainly the state's in a really great economy now. Times are good, very prosperous economy in Tennessee, but that won't always be the case. And it may not be the case through the next governor's term. So being able to manage a budget in those kind of circumstances is important. And not really just executive management at my company, but as the chairman of one of the largest nonprofits in the state, as the president of one of the largest construction industry organizations in the state, I've had a life of executive leadership that I think is well suited for what I'm pursuing here now.
Thank you.
You didn't mention that you're an Auburn graduate, and so the most important question of the day is, who are you going to root for in the Auburn-Tennessee game this weekend?
I will be staying home and quietly, not exposing my loyalties there, but I will say I'm always for the SEC team.
Okay, easier question. So what are your priorities going into the 2019 legislative session if you're elected, and what differences might you be setting in priorities than Governor Bill Haslam has been?
You know, my wife and I, when we announced our campaign, we decided to run the most aggressive grassroots campaign in Tennessee history. That's what we called it. And I am a person who really enjoys being face-to-face with voters and getting out to every single county. We said we were going to go to 95 counties in 95 days, and we did. We bought an old RV and wrapped it up and went out to meet the people. And I determined through that process what I really intuitively knew but confirmed it, no matter where people live in this state, in urban, suburban, rural communities, I believe people want a good job, they want a good school for their kid, and they want a safe neighborhood. And so those are the priorities that I see are really important. Those are what I want to wake up every day thinking about. Education is foundational to all three of those pieces. If you have a good education, you're probably going to have a good job. If you have a good job, you're probably not going to become part of the criminal justice system. So I really think education is foundational and important. I think that we have not put the emphasis on vocational and technical education in our public school system that we should have for the last 2 or 3 decades. As an employer of skilled tradespeople, I employ about 1,200. Most of them are skilled tradespeople. Many of them did not get a 4-year degree, and yet they have a career, a good career. And, you know, Lee Company was named by the Tennessean last year as the best large company to work for in Nashville. It's the 3rd time we've had that designation, and yet we struggle to fill skilled trade job openings we have. And I think that is due in large part to the fact that we've not had the right emphasis on vocational, technical, and even agricultural education in our school system. The 4 out of 10 kids in our state that don't go to college have giftings and talents that may be giftings and talents that college kids don't have, but we don't have an education system constructed to really create pathways for success for them, or really pathways for hope. That's one of the primary things I want to work on first, day one as governor, is begin to develop an emphasis in our education system, not just K through 12, but through post-secondary, that creates a real opportunity for vocational and technical education, for job. It's really about workforce development through education. Engaging the private sector in that, engaging the Department of Education in that. That's one of the first things I want to do.
Okay, now you would see that then as an extension of Governor Haslam's Drive to 55?
Well, I think I think Drive to 55 is a great program. We need to continue it. But I actually think that we need to bring that back down into K through 12.
Okay.
I think this starts in the 7th and 8th grade. I think I've often said, you know, Lee Company started a trade school 10 years ago. We have put 1,000 people through skilled trades training, in part because the problem is so bad that companies like mine have to develop our own solutions. So we've trained 1,000 in 10 years. I've said oftentimes we need to be doing that in high schools all across Tennessee. So it's not really just a Drive to 55 post-secondary initiative. It would be a K through 12 initiative that has work-based learning and apprenticeships and certificate attainment, even in high school. And the dialogue begins in middle school or junior high school, 7th and 8th grade, where we start talking to kids about the idea that, you know, you can be a doctor, you can be a teacher, you can be a plumber, cosmetologist, a lawyer, a farmer, and all of these are valid ways to be successful. And then construct an education system that actually validates all of those pathways. And I think we can improve the outcomes for success for our kids in a much greater way if we have that kind of a focus in K through 12, not just post-secondary.
I've had the opportunity to travel myself through the state quite a bit, and I would say we're almost in a crisis when it comes to a lack of a skilled workforce. And I've met a number of employers like yours who've had to come up with their own solutions. How is this hurting us economically, do you think, in terms of businesses that are not moving here? And will your solutions take care of that?
I think it's hurting us tremendously. I think we have companies that look at the workforce that we have and determine that it's not what it could be. When we think about attracting a large company to a site like the mega site, for example, in West Tennessee, we need that company to believe that there is, if they're going to bring 2,000 or 3,000 skilled jobs there, we need them to understand or believe that we have that skilled workforce. I think it profoundly would change the ability to attract companies, but what I really also think it changes is the ability for us to start businesses here. I've always said a business created in Tennessee is better, a job created in Tennessee is better than one brought here. When people have skills, they're more likely to be willing to start their own company, to start their own small business. And I've seen it in my own company. I don't know how many dozens of companies have been started by folks that were working at Lee Company, and over the 75 years that we've been in business, because when people have a skill and they see that there's an opportunity, then they feel empowered to start their own business. We have 15 counties in Tennessee that are distressed. They fall in the bottom 10% of poverty and joblessness in the country, and those are all rural. And in particular, I actually think that rural and inner city have some of the same challenges, but those rural communities with a lack of skilled workforce, it helps, it contributes to the decay of that part of our economy. So I think this focus on skilled trades through and not just, it's not just welding and plumbing and pipe fitting, it's coding. It's future vocational employment that may not require a 4-year degree. And as technology has expanded throughout our state, the ability for small businesses to be created as a result of a robust, skilled workforce plan through our education system, I think can really make a difference. And I think it can make a difference in the inner city as well. I talked about rural, but Wall Street Journal a year or so ago did an article about rural America being the new inner city. And it showed, the article was about the parallels between what's happening in rural America and what's happening in the inner city around joblessness and lack of skill and lack of hope. And I think we can really impact that. And I actually think we do it in large part by engaging the private sector in meaningful ways with the state.
Your opponent has wanted to differentiate himself from you through the Medicaid expansion issue. Tennessee has the highest rate per capita of hospital closures, and we've seen a tremendous amount of rural hospital closures. Why oppose Medicaid expansion? And if you do, what solutions do you have to keep hospitals open?
Yeah, I think that every Tennessean deserves to have access to quality health care that they can afford. As governor, that's going to be my goal, is that Tennesseans have access to quality health care that they can afford. What I don't want to do is pursue that down a path that I think is unsustainable. We have a fundamentally flawed healthcare system, in my view, in that we have escalating healthcare costs that rise much faster than the inflation rate. My own company's experience, and my experience with healthcare in part has been as an employer who purchases for 1,200 families. Our rates went up by 29% 2 years ago, and then they went up by 19% on top of that 29% the following year. That's an unsustainable, and my company's not significantly different than the experience of other companies. And that's an unsustainable rise that ultimately, unchecked, will take us down a path that I think is the wrong path for Tennessee. And remember, we've done this before. We did it back in the 90s. We expanded Medicaid. We were told that that we would be able to contain costs, that in fact it would lower costs. It didn't. And ultimately, we had to take hundreds of thousands of people off the rolls of Medicaid. I don't want to go down that path again. A federal plan that doesn't address the fundamental flaw is the wrong approach from my perspective. It happened the first time. It happened through the Obamacare years when we were told that costs would be lowered, that we could keep our doctors. We've had a 174% increase in costs since the onset of Obamacare, and rural hospitals have struggled through that season. I think going down that same path is a bad idea. What I think we ought to do is actually fix the problem or address the problem significantly before expanding an unsustainable program. There are ways to do that. We can, there are 3 points to our healthcare system: payers, providers, patients. At no point, really, in that trio of points is there an incentive to lower cost. You have a system in TennCare, for example, where a TennCare patient has a sick child, and they can either take their child to a primary care physician or they can take them to an ER. And there's no incentive whatsoever to choose one over the other. That's a flawed system that isn't going to ever lower costs. It's only going to expand the ever-increasing problem that we have. We have a private insurance plan where folks go in to get a procedure, they don't know what it costs. The provider generally can't tell them what it's going to cost. And for the most part, if you have private insurance, you don't really care what it costs because someone else is going to pay that premium. That's the kind of flaw, I think, that sets us up for an unsustainable path if we just expand under that current system without addressing the cost.
And talking about the rural hospital, certainly there are some challenges like the broadband issues that may make telemedicine a little bit challenging from that standpoint. What do you do to address the point now? Next year is going to be an interesting year because the mandate from Obamacare is going to be gone, and at the same time you may have more or less, depending on what the situation is in each market, people who seek or have coverage. What do you do to cover those needs? Let's say if you have a chainsaw accident in rural Tennessee, or if you have some other issue like that.
Yeah, I think that I want to look at a 15-year, 20-year solution. I want to look at. I like to, as a business person, I like to not think just about how we're going to solve tomorrow's problem, but what do we want the healthcare system to look like in Tennessee in 15 years? I've said that about high school. What do we want high school to look like in 15 years? What do we want our prison system to look like in 15 years? What do we want healthcare to look like? And that's where my belief that everyone ought to have access. I think we have to change the model. For one, we have to be certain that we do get technology, broadband, in every part of our state. We need to work really hard to bring together the public utilities, the private sector, whatever combination of efforts we can to get technology into those areas, because that will allow us to have telemedicine access that improves quality access for every Tennessean. I think we changed the model of a freestanding rural hospital that can't provide all of the services. They can't afford to provide all the services that they're being called upon to provide. There's a new model, and we have examples of it. Lewis County has a federally qualified medical center that provides essential services for those in a rural community, and then is networked with a specialist hospital and has improved transport for their patients. And it's not a full service freestanding hospital, but it allows those in those communities who have emergency needs or who have the needs for essential services, and then to network and move on to a larger provider down the road. That's the kind of model change that we have to have. We can't expect a model from 20 years ago to meet the needs of healthcare in the future.
Staying on medical for a moment, so drug overdose deaths are up. What do you think you can do to turn that tide here in Tennessee, whereas the Tennessean has reported we have more prescriptions for opioids than we have people?
Yeah, we're one of the most overprescribed states in the country. And so from my view, this drug epidemic, and it's not just opioids, it's now expanding, you know, to meth and heroin and cocaine and fentanyl, illegal drugs. But there are three pieces to it from my perspective. And the first is the system itself of prescriptions and overprescription. Too many pills, too many prescriptions, too many pain clinics. A system that allows us to be the most overprescribed state, or one of the most overprescribed states, is a system that has to be checked and reined in. And Governor Haslam has made a good first step on that. I think we ought to continue to look at reining in that system, and challenging the size of prescriptions, the quantity of prescriptions, and the availability of those prescriptions. We need to challenge that. That's the system piece of it. The second piece of it is law enforcement. And we have an ever increasing, when you do challenge the legal prescription system, then the other rises up. I think that we need to make Tennessee a place, for one thing, where drug traffickers don't want to operate. We need to have stiff penalties in Tennessee where traffickers decide they want to operate somewhere else besides Tennessee. And so we need to look to law enforcement. That's the second component, is the law enforcement side of it, and how we strengthen our approach from law enforcement toward it. And then the third piece is rehabilitation, treatment, mental health. That's the real underlying challenge that we have. There's ever increasing evidence that addiction is connected to trauma, that adverse childhood experiences are profoundly connected to this whole addiction problem, and recognizing the need to have a more expansive, a more broader scope to mental health and treatment and rehabilitation is important. The challenge, of course, there is government can never solve that problem. I mean, as that expands, and as treatment, the need for longer treatment and more mental health services expands, the government can never address that, which is, you know, I've oftentimes talked about the fact that government's not the answer, that the private sector, the nonprofit community is a really important part of addressing the greatest challenges of our day. I think that's true in the drug treatment and the mental health side of this drug problem that we have. We're going to have to call upon the nonprofit community, our church communities, our community organizations. We're going to have to call upon the community beyond government to address this. But we have to do this whole opioid and addiction problem has got to be addressed comprehensively because it's massive.
Do you have a role to play in that in terms of being the person who calls them together?
I think government plays a strong role there. Leads. You know, government has a role to lead. Even though they may not be the answer, they have a role in leading and assembling those who can be a part of the answer. I've called for an Office of Community and Faith-Based Initiatives to actually be a liaison between government and those nonprofit community organizations that are addressing some of the challenges of the day. I think we can create an environment where that part of our community can play a more effective role, particularly when we connect them among shared resources and duplicated services, and try to create an environment where they can work more efficiently together.
In recent years, Tennessee has made a lot of progress in its improving its K-12 education and its ranking among other states in a number of key areas. A lot of the approach through that the Republican legislature took was through accountability and teacher performance. But lately there's been problems too with testing. What is your feeling about continuing the TN Ready test? How should that be handled? And how should teacher performance evaluations be tied to their compensation? And how should test scores be tied to their performance evaluations?
Couple of comments about teachers. You talked about teachers. I think it's really important that we remember that teachers are where the rubber meets the road in educating our children. If we don't have an environment that is supporting teachers, and that doesn't just mean pay supporting teachers. We need to have an environment of competitive pay for our teachers. I happen to be married to a school teacher. She's not teaching right now, but she did for many, many years. And so we've had a lot of conversations around this. The environment by which teachers operate is really important. In our business, part of our mission statement says that we exist to create an environment where our employees can thrive. And I think that the Department of Education has a responsibility to create an environment where teachers can thrive, where they can be innovative and creative, where they can be allowed to do what they alone can do and what they do best. And part of that is a testing environment. 70% of the teachers in our state say that our current testing environment is not conducive to their ability to teach in the most effective way. So we have to look, when we have that happening with the most important spoke in the wheel, then we have to take a new look at that. As a business person, I also know that you can't improve what you don't measure. Measurement is absolutely critical. It's part of the reason that we've made progress in education is because we've implemented a greater degree of measurement. And we have made progress, and we need to continue that progress. But we need to make some adjustments because, like I said, in business, you can't improve what you don't measure, but if you measure too much or if you measure the wrong thing, then you'll actually have the opposite impact of what you want to have. And I think that's probably what we're finding out right now. We may measure too much. We may be measuring the wrong thing. We may be tying the wrong initiative to or incentive to a certain test. What I think is, on TN Ready, we certainly ought to reevaluate the vendor. And Governor Haslam is doing this right now. He's getting feedback on this process and what's good about it, what's bad about it. That's what we need to do. We need to go to teachers, to parents, to school leaders, and engage them in a real open, honest dialogue around what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. What we're measuring too much, what portion we may be measuring too much, and which tests are actually measuring the wrong thing. I've said we need to do a reset. Doesn't mean we need to throw it all out and start over. It just means we need to do a reset and really evaluate what's good about the current testing environment and what's not good about it. We do that. We do that in business all the time. You drive behavior by incentives, no doubt about that. And it's not manipulation. It's just saying let's create incentives that drive certain behavior. There are generally unintended consequences of that, but you don't throw out the whole system because you had an unintended consequence. You just look at it and say, all right, we didn't expect that, but now how can we make an adjustment to compensate for that unintended consequence?
You feel that the incentive should include tying teacher compensation in some way to performance evaluation and test scores?
I think so. I think we just have to look at how does that make sense and what do teachers agree is appropriate there. But I think it makes sense to make some connection there or to have it be a piece of the evaluation process. The question is how much a piece and to what degree that that really is something that teachers think is the best idea.
This is a very well-viewed live stream, by the way, and viewers have been commenting in. And one of the questions for the editorial board has been, where are the women in the room? And we certainly regret that Maria DeVarine, our executive editor for the Tennessean, couldn't make it today due to a conflict. But it does lead to a question related to gender equity and diversity. What is your commitment to ensuring that your government, if elected, is diverse, and how will you spread that notion around the state?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and you know, we need to always make sure that we respect the dignity of women, and that includes a commitment to diversity in the workplace, in state government, in society, really. I have a daughter who is 23. She just graduated from college. She's entering the workforce. She has interviewed for jobs and will be looking to have a full-time job, and she and I have talked about this very thing, that I certainly hope and expect that the environment that she walks into will be one where she feels safe, where she feels respected, where her dignity is preserved, where she's given an equal opportunity to her male counterparts, whether that's pay or an opportunity to advance. You know, that is really important, and we have to be committed to that, and I would be committed to that in my administration, and also committed to that throughout state government.
There had been a question asked of your opponent at a Rotary Club event recently about whether he would appoint a chief diversity officer. Do you see something like that, a position like that, in your administration?
I think the most important thing is to just be committed to diversity, and that I will be.
Thank you.
So shifting the topic here a little bit, the takedown of Confederate monuments in Memphis last year and the state legislature's strident response does raise question about the appropriateness of local control on certain issues. To what extent should local municipalities be able to make those decisions without state intervention?
You know, I think that first of all, let me say that one of the things I hope people will see in me as governor is a person who fundamentally believes that in the most divisive and challenging subjects, I'd really want to be a leader who brings people together. I think we have an environment in our country that has grown increasingly divided. Pick your subject, but it's grown increasingly divided, on the verge of toxic in certain circumstances. And I think leadership has a real opportunity to bring together opposing views, have them come together and agree upon what we're going to, what is it that we do agree upon, and move forward there. Secondly, I think that local decision making is always the best idea if you can do that, and I'll always defer and hope to look to local communities to be able to decide what they want in their own communities. This particular incident was unfortunate in a lot of reasons, a lot of ways. There was a process in place working through the Historical Commission that was a loophole found, and a decision made as a result of that loophole that probably was not the best way to execute on removing that. And then the decision by the legislature to withhold funding on an unrelated future project is probably not the best way to resolve that. As a leader in that environment, I would have looked to bring together that local and the Historical Commission, said, how can we do this in a way that doesn't create such a backlash? I do think that fundamentally it's a mistake to whitewash history. I do think it's a mistake to remove monuments around a portion of our history that we may not even be proud of. I think it's a mistake to remove reminders of things that we hope we never repeat, as well as reminders of things that we're really proud of and that are part of our history and legacy. So I think removing monuments in broadly is not the right approach to the problem. But I also think this particular incident was not handled well, and we could handle it better in the future.
How would you handle the situation, or recommend handling the situation that's happening now in Williamson County and Franklin, where no one is arguing in favor of removing the monument on the public square there, but some people are opposing the addition of more markers that add to the historical story?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect opportunity to bring people together and say, well, you know, how can we do this in a way that what do we agree upon, and what can we do going forward that would have everyone feel favorable about the future. And I think we could do that. That's my community. I think we could pull together leaders and create a solution there that works.
Over the years, there's been quite a few exemptions passed to the state's Public Records Act that have closed down areas of information to the public. There's a committee that, a legislative interim committee that is meeting during this time to examine these exemptions, see if steps can be taken to maybe address some of them. One in particular is the forever exemption of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation that holds that their investigative files are closed forever. That's even more stringent than the FBI. And whereas other law enforcement organizations around the state have their files open for public scrutiny after the investigations are closed. How do you feel about about open government in general, about this process of trying to limit exemptions, and in particular this TBI forever exemption?
I think the overall, you asked about my overall view of transparency, and I think that it's really important that we have a commitment to transparency where it makes sense. Taxpayer dollars, taxpayers should understand how their government operates. They should know where their taxpayer dollars are spent, and to the degree that we can minimize exemptions and exceptions to open records and open meetings, we ought to do that. I think it's appropriate to, you know, we started at one point and then we began making exceptions and exemptions, and it makes sense from my view to examine those periodically even and say which ones can we remove. Anytime we can remove an exemption that is in the best interest of Tennesseans, we ought to look at it. So I think transparency is really important. With regard to the specific TBI ruling, I think forever is a long time. And so I certainly would look to consider changing that and see what the implications are for changing it, why that rule really is there forever. And but I think we ought to always look for opportunities to create transparency in government, recognizing that there are certain circumstances where, you know, the overarching view is what's best for Tennesseans. And sometimes that includes some level of discretion. But those need to be the exception rather than the broad exception. So I look to transparency.
Sometimes in the past, or until the recent administration, a gesture to openness has been governors revealing their income tax returns. That's something that you've opted not to do. Could you speak to why you made that decision?
Yeah. You know, I run a private business, and opening my personal tax returns is going to reveal information about other people, not just me, and about trade and information about a private company that impacts employees. And so for that reason, I've chosen not to give my personal tax returns.
Over the last few years, a coalition of several hundred business leaders have joined together in an initiative called Tennessee Thrives which is requesting that the legislature not delve into issues of social issues, for example, bathroom bills, other things that may be hostile to the LGBTQ community here in Tennessee. What is your position on that, especially if these issues come to the table again, be it a bathroom bill or other? How would you address that as governor, and what message would you send to Tennessee's LGBTQ community about this?
I think that it's important that, to the degree that we can keep those decisions on to a local decision-making process, and because mostly what we're talking about here are schools, and that's the best way to handle that. We need to make sure that those local jurisdictions are not threatened by outside groups that have that threaten their ability to make their decisions locally. But I'm always going to be in favor of those decisions being made locally.
Very good. And just to follow up in terms of you may be confronted with a bill that could pass. For example, Governor Haslam was confronted with the counselor bill a few years ago, which he allowed to become law. What is your thought process of dealing with legislators? Because it certainly could come back to you if you're elected governor.
Yeah, I mean, some of that's hypothetical, not knowing what a bill would be, and so it would depend on what specifics of a bill are. Here's what what I believe is that we can address those challenges while upholding and defending the rights of those who, for example, hold a traditional view, at the same time making decisions that work for all Tennesseans. I think we can do that, and that would always be my approach. I can't speak to a particular piece of legislation unless I saw it, but that's going to be my approach.
So let's keep talking about legislators for a moment. So the General Assembly will obviously stay in the hands of Republicans easily. But within that group of people, you have libertarians, social conservatives, moderates. How will you work with them? Because they don't always get along amongst themselves, as well as Democrats to fulfill your agenda.
I said earlier that what I think people will see in me as a governor is a person who wants to convene. I really do believe that, and we do this in business frequently, where we bring together competing interests and put them around the table and say, let's cast a vision for where we want to go. And I know that you have competing interests, so let's put everyone's interests on the table, and then we'll cast a vision, set a strategy, and get there, agree upon what we disagree upon, and come and agree upon what we do agree upon, and go forward from there. That's going to be my approach with the legislature. People ask me frequently, what about this legislature? As if that's almost like as if it's a bad thing. We have really committed citizen legislators on both sides of the aisle, on all. These are people who have given up a piece of their life to serve Tennesseans, and I respect that. And every single one of them, regardless of what their views are. I look to develop relationships with legislators. I think I think the most important thing in convening is doing that through relationship. And so I look to develop relationships on both sides of the aisle with legislators across the spectrum, and work together to advance what's best for Tennesseans. I actually look forward to that challenge.
So your opponent has cited his specific government experience as, I think it's fair to say, a huge advantage in that process. What do you think about that?
I actually think not having government political experience is a huge advantage. I don't have experience with relationships with lobbyists. I don't have experience with multiple cycles of donors that I'm beholden to. I don't have relationships and experience with legislators that have done things for me or me. I'm not beholden to any of the system. I actually believe it's a strength to come from outside government and to have experience in the private sector, in the nonprofit community, and not just have experience in government. You know, our founders, when they founded this nation, they left a country that was ruled by the ruling class, and they started a new country, and they did it based on the idea of self-governance, that we would be a government of the people, that we would engage people from the private sector, and that would actually be a very effective way to govern, that we the people would self-govern. And I think we've moved far away from that premise or that idea, but I actually think they knew that there was a real strength in coming from outside government to bring fresh ideas, private sector solutions, nonprofit passion into government and bring about the kind of changes that need to be brought about. When you're not a part of the status quo, it's a little easier to challenge the status quo, and so I think it's actually a strength.
Thank you.
As Governor Haslam was looking for ways to save money, seek efficiencies, he pushed for and to some extent implemented outsourcing of services to maintain government buildings and such. The University of Tennessee was at Knoxville was among the institutions that rejected that. How do you feel about outsourcing? Do you feel like the University of Tennessee at Knoxville should revisit that question? And do you feel like this is an opportunity to gain efficiencies in state government?
My view on outsourcing, when I consider outsourcing, my first consideration is a Tennessee taxpayer. I feel obligated to look out for the taxpayers and the citizens of Tennessee first and foremost. That would be that's my first and foremost obligation. So when I consider outsourcing opportunity, I consider A, will it save that taxpayer money? Will we save taxpayer dollars doing it? And B, will we sacrifice any level of quality of service? And C, is there an unintended consequence that we don't want to happen? So, you know, every outsourcing opportunity has to stand on its own merit. But if it passes those three litmus tests, then we certainly ought to look at it. If it's going to save taxpayer dollars, and we're not going to sacrifice any quality of service, and the unintended consequences don't surface, then we certainly ought to consider doing that, whatever that outsourcing is. Now, let me give you an example of how that doesn't, where one of those falls through. We have an outsourcing opportunity for a state park in a rural community that if we don't do it appropriately, we might save taxpayer dollars and we might improve the services or at least hold steady to the quality of service, but local residents might lose their jobs as a part of the outsourcing opportunity. And those local folks may be residents of an already distressed county, one of the 15 distressed counties we have in this state. That's an unintended consequence that we don't want to happen. We don't want to make the distressed county and the economy of that distressed county suffer in order to save the broader taxpayer dollars for the state of Tennessee. That's an example where you kind of look at that opportunity for outsourcing and say, that doesn't work. We don't need to do that. We have an unintended consequence that is going to make it worse. But other opportunities where those three things and the outcomes are improved and the money is saved and there's not an unintended consequence that's bad for the local economy, then we absolutely ought to look at it.
Now, I'm not familiar enough with all the aspects of your business. I don't know if you would be involved in anything that might tie into outsourcing, but in a greater, larger question, how will you address potential conflicts of interest regarding your company, which I think does do some business with the state of Tennessee?
We'll likely unwind our, that's a question that I'll resolve when I become elected. I certainly am not making plans. I have an election to win, and I'm very focused on that. I'm not really doing a lot of planning beyond that focus. I have said before, though, that it's likely that we'll structure the company in a way that prevents any conflicts of interest regarding contracts with the state or otherwise, and that will be my plan going forward. I will be committed to minimizing or eliminating conflicts of interest for my business with regard to the state.
One of the reasons given for why the multi-billion-dollar transit system failed in Nashville a few months ago was the lack of an ability of regions to work together to pass a plan. What is your position on amending the Improve Act, which allowed for these transit referendums in counties and certain cities? Because you, living in Williamson County, you've certainly seen the traffic get worse and worse, and even coming into Nashville, it's a situation. So what's our next step for being able to provide those transportation solutions?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not sure that the real reason for rejecting the transit plan was a lack of regional transit authority. I think that the concerns around debt and spending were a big piece of what was the reason behind rejecting that plan. And I tend to have those same concerns around debt and spending of a plan that, in my view, may have been obsolete by the time it was completed. We do have a real we have a real changing transportation industry. With the onset of, with the increase in driverless vehicles and technology around ride sharing and unutilized technology around traffic control that we haven't implemented in our state and certainly not in our city, we have opportunities through technology to really address some of the traffic problems in particular that I think we ought to look at before we spend $10 billion or create a greater debt and or spending approach to it, a big government spending approach. I think that's what really caused that rejection of that plan. But you know, the Improve Act has just been implemented. I don't think we ought to be changing it right now. I think we ought to see how it's going to play out, what effect it's going to have. I do think that local decision making around a regional transit authority, for example, or a regional approach, that really is a local decision for the most part. I don't think the state ought to impose its view, its plan. Maybe that region could come to the state and say, we have a plan, but I don't think the state ought to go to the region and say, you should create a plan.
Memphis seems like it's on the verge of taking off, but it also and Shelby County together have the state's highest concentration of poverty. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that and also help the businesses and the greater community of Memphis see the same type of prosperity that we're seeing here in Nashville?
I'm encouraged that you say that Memphis is on the verge of taking off, because I agree with you. I think it's rounded a corner. I've said before, the accelerated transformation of Memphis and Shelby County, it's why a year ago we rolled out a commitment to Memphis and Shelby. I think if Tennessee's going to lead the nation, and that's my vision, then the accelerated transformation of that region of the state is really important. So I agree that it is beginning to take off, and there are things going very much in the right direction. You know, poverty is a part of opportunity or lack thereof. And earlier I talked about how fundamental education is to good job, good school for your kids, safe neighborhood. Those three things that I think matter to every single Tennessean. Those are the same things that matter to a single mom living in poverty with young children in the urban center of Memphis. And the way we address that is, as I said before, fundamentally through education. I talked a little bit about vocational technical education. I think providing opportunities and pathways to success, which are really pathways to hope for those in that poverty center, in the portion of that city that are in poverty, providing those pathways to hope is absolutely the key. And we do that through education reform. We do it through engagement of the private sector in the heart of that city. And I actually, too, believe that we create an environment for the nonprofit community to work significantly. There's an organization in Memphis called Neighborhood Christian Centers that's doing remarkable work. There is a large suburban church that has a literacy program called Arise to Read that's working with and around literacy in the inner city that does significant work. Early childhood education and literacy is the key to success in education, particularly in those areas where there's an achievement gap and where we have poverty. All of those things brought to bear in a more concentrated effort in the center of Memphis will help in its transformation. But one of the key things is just recognizing that the ripple effects of an increased transformation in Shelby County are enormous for our state, and therefore we need to take a really hard look at what's happening there. And there's a lot of work being done already. I mean, the head of schools there, the superintendent of schools, Dorsey Hobson, who has endorsed and supported my campaign, is doing great work in the public school systems there. We've met several times around how it is that we can continue to increase the improvement they've had. They have an innovation zone in their worst performing schools, and they've improved their priority listings of schools, which is the schools that are in trouble, have gone from, I believe, 69 priority schools down to 27 over the last 5 years. There's a lot of progress being made in the education system there. We just need to continue to accelerate that improvement.
And then helping the business community beyond education, particularly in competing against Mississippi and Arkansas. What role is there for the state?
We really need to look at the business environment specifically in that part of the country that competes with Mississippi. Our franchise and excise tax, for example, is higher than Mississippi's. It creates an incentive for companies to be located right across the line instead of in our state. We need to look at that. We need to really look hard at can we lower that particular tax to create a more business-friendly environment in Tennessee than in adjacent states. It's very important we look at that.
I think you have time for one more question from Jack, and then we'll get to our conclusion.
Great.
Speaking a little bit on another dimension of education, the USA Today Network is reporting right now that about 1 in every 3 days there is either a threat of some kind of to the schools or an actual weapon found in schools in Tennessee. And this, of course, has been an area of concern across the country for many years. How can students and parents be better assured of safety in Tennessee while their children are in school, and what can the state do about that?
Yeah, that's a terrific problem. I can't imagine my kid going off to school and not coming home as a result of a shooting in their school. And we have to do whatever we can do as a state to protect our children. That is, when I consider this question and what we need to do, for me, the answer starts with whatever we can do. And it's it rises to a level of importance above and beyond many things. And I have said we should strengthen our commitment to either school resource officers, to retired military as part of the solution. I have said that if a teacher is willing to be a part of the solution, we should consider that. We should consider whatever avenue we can to make certain that we have an environment in our school system that children are protected from violence, gun violence or otherwise.
I want to thank our viewers and also our editorial board members here today. Now, Mr. Lee, as we conclude here, we've been asking all statewide candidates, do you commit and pledge to be civil during this campaign? And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And, you know, a year and a half ago when we started our campaign, my wife and I talked about what kind of a campaign we wanted to run. And I said then, no matter what anyone advises us, I want to run a positive campaign. And we have committed, throughout the primary, we committed to not run a negative campaign, to not run negative ads, to not disparage opponents. I think that there has become an increasingly toxic environment around politics that is distasteful to me and distasteful to Tennesseans and really distasteful in the country. And because of that, we made a strong commitment through our campaign to run a positive campaign. I will continue to run that positive campaign all the way through the end of this. And what I really want to do is continue that approach in how it is that we run state government. I think that Tennessee has a unique opportunity because of the value system of Tennesseans to approach government, politics, campaigns in a much more positive way, and that would be that's my value system, and that's what I hope to take forth to the Capitol.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. And to our viewing audience, we want to thank you very much again for this. You can replay this interview and also other interviews with statewide candidates. Remember, Tuesday, October 9th is the deadline to register to vote for the November 6th election, and early voting begins on October 17th. Have a great day.